The drone fell out of the crate and hit the floor with a sound that made me WSC. That was my first introduction to Magpie, not a handoff, not a briefing, not even a proper delivery, a Velhari. Logistics officer dropped the crate from about knee height, the latch gave way, and the thing tumbled out onto the permaseat floor of Outpost KL7 only. Remaining supply depot, one of its rote arms snapped against the ground, the chassis cracked along the left side, the single lens that served as its forward sensor flickered once and went dark. I stared at it, it stared at nothing. Commander Ithrex of the Velhari stood just inside the doorway, his four arms folded in the configuration his species used when they wanted to communicate patience but were actually communicating contempt. He was tall, gray-skinned with eyes like polished obsidian that reflected light in a way that made you feel you were being cataloged rather than looked at. Accord has provided you with a reconnaissance asset, he said. His standard was flawless, each word carved with precision. It is decommissioned but structurally viable. Use it as you see fit. I crouched down and picked up the drone. It was about the size of a large dog, hexagonal in shape, with 6 rotor arms arranged around a central body. 4 of the 6 arms were bent or broken. The armored casing on its underside had been repaired at least twice before, and both repairs had failed. There was a serial plate on the back that read MQ9 Recon Unit, and below that in red lettering that someone had stamped there without any ceremony at all the words Disposal Unit. I read that twice. This is disposal equipment. I said it is what the Accord could allocate. If said you requested a drone asset, we have provided one. I looked at him over the top of the broken machine. He did not look away. He also did not look sorry. My name is Sierra Vance. I'm a warrant officer in the Human Coalition Engineering Corps, which is a long title for a job that basically means I fix things that other people have given up on. I was 29 years old when I volunteered to stay behind at Outpost KL7 on the moon called Dreskin Roman 4, and I will be honest with you, I did not volunteer because I was brave. I volunteered because I understood the geometry of the situation better than anyone else in the room, and the geometry said that if someone did not stay and slow the Shreth collectives advance, the coalition's withdrawal would collapse within 48 hours, and the people who were evacuating would not make it to the orbital transports in time. So I stayed. There were 14 other people who volunteered the same moment I did. They were all told no. I was told yes because I was the only field engineer in the group, and field engineers, the Accord decided, were the only humans worth the oxygen on a moon that was about to be overrun. I took that as a compliment. I tried to. Outpost KL7 was not a large base. It had been a forward observation post at the start of the Shreth incursion, then briefly a resupply hub, and now it was the last human structure standing on Dreskin Roman for Northern Continent. The Shreth Collective had swept through everything else in a pattern of geometric precision that the Coalition's tactical analysts described as beautiful, in the same tone they used when describing something horrifying. The Shreth did not charge, they did not rush, they advanced in crystalline formations, each unit perfectly spaced, each movement calculated to the centimeter, and they did not stop until there was nothing left to stop for. In 11 years of fighting the Shreth, no Organic ground force had made them. Withdraw from a committed advance, not once, not anywhere. I knew all of this. When I volunteered, this is relevant information. Ithrex was still in the doorway when I stood up with the broken drone under my arm. Around us the base was nearly empty. The evacuation had been running for 6 hours. There were crates stacked everywhere, most of them half empty, left behind because the transports ran out of cargo space. I could hear the distant sound of a Velhari shuttle cycling its engines somewhere outside. The Shreth Vanguard will reach this position in approximately 71 hours. Ether said the Accord recommends you use the drone for advanced observation and then proceed to emergency extraction. Point Gamma when contact is imminent. He paused. There will be a pickup window of 4 minutes at extraction point Gamma. After that, we cannot guarantee transit safety. What he meant was after that we will not wait for you. I nodded. Understood. He lingered a moment longer, and I thought for just a second that he might say something else, something with a human shape to it, maybe a word or two that acknowledged that he was leaving a single person behind on a moon that was about to be covered in an alien hive mind. But he turned and left without anything more, and the depot door closed behind him, and then I was alone. I stood in the silence for a few seconds, listening to it. Then I set Magpie down on a workbench and turned on the depot lights. Let me tell you what I had. The outpost covered roughly 300 m across its main compound, with a secondary equipment shed to the north and a buried fuel line that connected to a generator block on the east side. The main building had a communications array on the roof, most of its components still functional. The supply depot where I was standing contained about 40% of what had been stored there a week ago. The rest had been loaded onto transports or deemed too heavy to move and bolted to the floor. The vehicle bay had 2 ground crawlers that had been stripped for parts, the frames sitting on bare axles. There was a rack of emergency flares, the kind you use to signal for air pickup when your locator beacon fails. There was a crate of mining charges left behind by a geology survey team that had passed through 6 weeks earlier, never retrieved because the evacuation orders came before anyone could arrange return shipping. There was a soil spectrometer, 2 broken water recyclers, communications booster still in its original packing, and a coffee maker. There was also mounted to the south wall, and almost certainly forgotten, a set of experimental neural interface hardware. It was a human prototype, part of a program the Accord had politely described as biologically unconventional, and less politely called a waste of development resources. The idea behind it was simple. Instead of piloting a drone remotely through a screen and a joystick, you connected to it directly through a lightweight neural bridge. You did not control the drone, you became the drone. Your sensory input merged with its sensor feed. When it tilted left, your inner ear felt the tilt. When its camera swung to track a target, your eyes tracked with it. The program had been shelved because human pilots reported the feedback was overwhelming, disorienting, too much sensation coming from something that was not your body. I read the research notes once. I thought the other pilots were not wrong about the sensation. I just thought they were wrong about it being a problem. I looked at Magpie on the workbench. One working thruster, a cracked chassis, a dead sensor array, a rotor arm held on by the Last thream of its mounting bracket. I pulled a stool up to the bench. Okay, I said to the empty room, let's see what you are. I opened the drone's access panel with a flat tool and looked. Inside, the core processor was intact. That was the first good news I'd had all day. The navigation chip was corrupted, which explained why they decommissioned it, but the processor itself could run if I gave it something to work with. The power cell was at 42%. The internal gyroscope was cracked but not destroyed. The thermal management system was offline because someone had removed the heat exchanger, probably to use it in something else. I sat there for a long time with a light on my head and my hands in Magpie's guts. And I started thinking, outside the last Velhari shuttle broke atmosphere, I felt the vibration of it through the floor, through the stool, up through my spine. When it faded, the silence that came after was the kind that is weight to it, the kind you can press your hands against. I did not let myself think about the 71 hours. I thought about the coffee maker instead, because the coffee maker had a heating coil that conducted electricity in a specific way that I thought might solve the sensor array problem if I could find a way to bridge the gap in the circuitry. I thought about the communications booster because its capacitors stored charge in a pattern that looked, if you squinted at the specs, like the foundation of an electromagnetic pulse emitter, not a powerful one, not a weapon by any traditional definition, but the Shreth collective was a silicon-based hive mind that communicated through bioelectric resonance signals that passed between every single unit in the field. If you interrupted that signal, even briefly, even messily, even with something built out of a coffee maker and a communications relay, you would have a few seconds of chaos in a machine that had never once experienced chaos. I stood up and went to find a screwdriver. It was not courage that kept me moving through that first night. It was the specific human inability to look at a broken thing and leave it broken. I have been this way my entire life. My mother called it stubbornness. My engineering instructors called it aptitude. My exartner called it exhausting. I called it Tuesday. I worked through the first night with nothing but the depot lights and the sound of my own breathing and the occasional ping of metal cooling in the walls of the outpost. I did not think about the Shreth. I thought about the coil in my hands and the wire I was running, and whether the mounting bracket on Magpie's broken rotor arm could be reinforced with a strip of steel from one of the crawler frames. I thought about the soil spectrometer and the very specific kind of sensor sensitivity it had that, if integrated into Magpie's forward array, would let the drone detect the electromagnetic signature of a HFY unit at 200 m. I thought about my father, who used to set off fireworks at the edge of his wheat field to scare deer out of the crop rows, and I thought that was interesting that I was thinking about that, and I made a note in the back of my mind to come back to it later. By the time the moon's thin sun came up, Magpie was still broken, but it was broken in new and interesting ways, and I had a plan. I found a paint marker in the bottom of a supply drawer, the kind used for labeling equipment crates. It was red. I uncapped it, thought for a moment, and then drew a face on the front of Magpie's nose cone, 2 eyes, wide and slightly alarmed looking, wide mouth full of sharp teeth. It looked ridiculous. It made me feel Better immediately. I still had 68 hours. I got back to work. The second day was about the sensor array. The original array had 4 components and 3 of them were fried in a way that no amount of reconnecting was going to fix. 4th was intact, but alone, it could not do anything useful. What I needed was sensitivity, breadth, the ability to detect not just movement but composition, heat signature, electromagnetic output. I pulled the soil spectrometer apart on the east workbench. It was a beautiful piece of equipment built by a geology company based in Newcastle, designed to analyze mineral content at depth by reading the way different materials absorbed and reflected specific light frequencies. It had 12 sensor channels, each tuned to a different part of the spectrum. I could not use all 12. The power draw would have drained Magpie's cell in under an hour, but 3 of them, the thermal channel, the electromagnetic channel, and the vibrational resonance channel, drew much less power and together would tell me more about a HFY unit than the original array ever could. Problem was that the spectrometer was designed to sit on the ground and point downward, and its housing was about 3 times too large to fit inside Magpie's chassis. I took the housing apart. This took 4 hours. The internal components were mounted on a circuit board that was exactly 2 cm too wide for Magpie's sensor bay, which I discovered only after I had already removed the board from its housing. I stared at the board for a while, then I got a file from the tool rack and spent 40 minutes very carefully removing 2 cm of components that were not connected to the 3 channels I needed. It fit. The connections were not standard. Nothing I was doing was standard. I spliced the spectrometer board into Magpie's sensor bus using wire I stripped from the communications booster, insulated each junction with thermal tape, and then powered up the array to test it. Magpie's sensor display flickered on. It showed me the wall of the depot. It showed me the heat signature of the coffee maker, still warm on the counter. It showed me the faint electromagnetic hum of the generator block outside and the buried fuel line running beneath the floor and the trace vibration of wind moving against the outer wall. It was not perfect. The readings were noisy, overlapping, cluttered with interference. I would need to learn to read through. But it worked. I put my hand in front of the sensor array. The display lit up with my heat signature, the bioelectric field around my skin, the vibration of my pulse. Magpie could see me. Good, I said. Now let's talk about what you're going to do with that. The navigation chip was the next problem. The HFY would be coming from the north across a flat basalt plain that ran from the edge of the forest belt to the outpost perimeter. I knew this because I had the coalition's terrain mapping data and because the HFY always advanced across the most geometrically optimal approach vector. That was one of their consistencies. They did not take the interesting route. They took the correct route. I needed Magpie to be able to move across that plane with precision. And with a corrupted nav chip, it could not do that on its own. The neural interface hardware on the south wall stared at me. I had read the research notes on it once 2 years ago during a slow week on a different deployment. The program had been abandoned after the test pilots reported that the sensory feedback was too disorienting to allow effective control. What they described was a flood of input. The drone sensors feeding into your own nervous system, while your body's natural senses kept running, creating a doubled, layered experience that most people found overwhelming. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the fact that I had spent the last 14 years working in loud, chaotic, high-input environments, shipyards, combat engineering depots, forward repair facilities where things were always going wrong at once. And you learned very fast how to filter information and focus on the one thing that mattered. I thought about the fact that I had once repaired a thruster coupling on a coalition frigate while the ship was being fired upon, and I had done it calmly, methodically, one step at a time, because chaos was just another kind of environment, and environments could be adapted to. I took the neural interface off the wall. The headset was lightweight, a thin band of sensor contacts that rested along the temples, forehead, and base of the skull. The interface cable connected to a universal port that most drone models had for diagnostic access. Magpie had one tucked under the left side panel. I connected the cable. I sat down in the chair with the headset on my head, and I looked at Magpie sitting on the workbench across from me, and I said, "This is going to be strange, and I am completely fine with that." I activated the interface. The first sensation was pressure, a warm, expanding feeling behind my eyes, like the moment just before you sneeze, but sustained and growing. Then the depot shifted. I could still see it through my own eyes, but now I was also seeing it through Magpie's sensor array, the heat map of the room, the electromagnetic signatures of the equipment, the vibration profile of the floor, two sets of input layered over each other like two transparencies held up to the same light. My inner ear felt something that was not my body. A slight list to the right, which was Magpie's chassis settling on the uneven surface of the workbench. I reached out through the interface and fired Magpie's one functional thruster. For half a second, the drone lifted off. The bench drifted left and bumped gently into the wall. The impact ran through the interface, and I felt it as a dull tap against the side of my skull, like someone knocking on a door. Not painful, just present. I guided Magpie back to center. It took me 3 attempts. By the 4th lift, I was hovering it steadily at chest height in the middle of the depot. The doubled vision was not disorienting. It was rich. It was layered. It was exactly like standing in a loud room and learning which sounds mattered and which ones did not. I kept the connection open for 2 hours. By the end of it, I could fly Magpie through the depot in the dark, because my own eyes told me nothing useful in the dark, but Magpie's thermal sensors showed me everything perfectly. 2 sets of senses, each covering the gaps the other could not fill. I took the headset off and sat quietly for a few minutes. Through the neural link, I had noticed something I wanted to test. Later, when Magpie's electromagnetic channel picked up a strong signal source, I could feel it as a very faint warmth in the back of my left hand. Not real warmth, phantom warmth. My nervous system translating unfamiliar input into the nearest sensation it had a name for. The Shreth Collective communicated through bioelectric resonance at a frequency that would register as a strong signal on Magpie's electromagnetic channel. When the Shreth were near, I would feel it in my left hand. Before I could see them, I looked at the mining charges stacked in the corner. Then I looked at the emergency flares. Then I looked at the coffee maker. Then, I looked at the vehicle bay where the stripped crawlers sat on their bare frames, their steel plating still bolted to the sides like useless armor on dead machines. I stood up. I got a cutting torch from the tool rack. I walked to the vehicle bay. The steel plating was form thick, coated in a heat-resistant polymer that was standard on coalition ground vehicles. It was heavy. It was also the exact kind of heavy that if you bolted it to the underside and forward face of a drone chassis with cargo straps, because you had nothing better, would provide enough protection against low-grade crystal fragment dispersal to keep the core processor intact even if everything else got hit. Reactive armor was a generous term for what I was building. Cargo strap armor was more accurate. I cut the first panel free at midnight. On the fourth night, after 3 days of building and testing and tearing apart and rebuilding, I sat in the depot with Magpie floating beside me at shoulder height, and I ran through the full system one more time. The sensor array pulled from the spectrometer, working. The electromagnetic pulse emitter built from the communications booster. Capacitor bank working. Rain approximately 40 m duration, 11 seconds per burst. Recharge time 9 minutes. The fragmentation ring mining charges mounted in a dispersal bracket I had fabricated from the crawler's axle housing, activated by remote detonator trigger integrated into the neural interface, armed the chaff and flare system, emergency flares, and the entire contents of a recreation kit that included, for reasons I had never questioned, a full set of fireworks for the Coalition's Founding Day celebration, loaded into 2 side-mounted tubes built from water recycler piping, loaded the cargo strap armor, 3 panels of vehicle plating bolted to Magpie's underside and forward face, holding mostly 1 thruster, 4 patched rotor arms, 2 of which I was not completely confident in, a sensor array built from geology equipment, a weapon system that would not pass any military inspection ever conducted, and a neural interface that every qualified researcher in the program had declared too disorienting for effective use. I looked at Magpie's painted face, the sharp-toothed mouth, the wide, slightly alarmed eyes. "You ready?" I asked. Drone hummed at idle. The sensor display showed the room and the heat of my body, and the electromagnetic trace of my own heartbeat. I had 17 hours until the Shri arrived. I laid down on a cot I had moved into the depot, pulled a coat over my shoulders, and closed my eyes. I slept for 4 hours dreamlessly, which was a mercy. When I woke up, I drank the last of the coffee from the maker I had partially disassembled because I had left the heating coil in, and the carf still worked. It was the best coffee I had ever had, possibly because it might be the last coffee I ever had. Impending danger makes everything taste sharper. I picked up the neural interface headset. I put it on through Magpie sensors. The outpost came alive around me. The heat map of the building, the wind moving across the basalt plain. To the north, the deep electromagnetic hum of the planet below, the faint signal traces of Coalition ships in high orbit above, too far away to help close enough to watch. I wondered if they were watching. I hoped they were watching. "Okay, Magpie," I said softly, "let's go. Introduce you to something that has never met anything like you before." I opened the depot door. The plain stretched north, flat and gray, and enormous under a sky the color of old pewter, somewhere out there 70 kilometers away and closing, 300 HFY. Units were moving toward me in perfect formation. I felt the warmth in the back of my left hand, very faint, very far away, but there I exhaled slowly, and then I sent Magpie north into the wind. The warmth in my left hand had been building for 6 minutes. When I saw them through Magpie's thermal sensors, they appeared as cold shapes against the ground, which seemed wrong until I remembered that the HFY were silicon-based and did not produce body heat the way organic creatures did. They showed up not as warmth but as the absence of it. Crystalline masses moving across the basalt plain, their surfaces refracting the thin light of the moon-sun in slow prismatic shifts, beautiful the way a landslide is beautiful, organized the way a machine is organized. There were 341 of them. I had expected 300. The coalition analysts had said 300. The HFY had brought 341. I filed this information away and kept watching through my own eyes back. Inside the outpost I was sitting, cross-legged on the depot floor with my hands resting on my knees and my eyes half closed. To anyone looking at me, I would have appeared to be meditating or possibly asleep or possibly in some state between the two. What I was actually doing was tracking 341 alien units across 2 km of open terrain through the sensor array of a drone that was held together with cargo straps in determination. The HFY moved in 3 concentric formations. The outer ring was the largest, 112 units spaced at 8 m intervals, forming a perimeter that moved as one piece. Inside that was a tighter cluster of about 160 units, the main body of the advance, moving in interlocking geometric cells that shifted and rotated as they progressed, like the gears of a mechanism. At the center, smallest and most protected, were 69 units that my sensor array identified by their electromagnetic output as command nodes, the units that carried the highest concentration of hive mind signal processing. The command nodes were what I needed to reach if I had been flying a standard military drone with standard military weapons. The correct approach would have been obvious: stay high, stay fast, hit the outer ring and fall back, added the formation from distance, avoid direct engagement. Every tactical doctrine the coalition had developed against the HFY was built around this principle: do not let them close the distance, do not let the geometric formation surround you, stay mobile, stay unpredictable. Good advice built for weapons I did not have. What I had was one working thruster cargo strap armor, a pulse emitter with a 40 m range, mining charges buried in the ground, and a collection of fireworks inside water recycler piping, and the element of being completely inexplicable. The HFY crossed the 1 km mark. I felt the warmth in my left hand sharpen into something more specific, a prickling sensation that moved between my knuckles. Their network signal was getting stronger as the units concentrated together. 341 points of bioelectric communication, all feeding into the same hive consciousness, all processing the same data at the same moment. I thought about what that meant. A hive mind is extraordinarily good at certain things. It is good at pattern recognition because every unit is feeding information into the same shared analysis. It is good at real-time Adaptation because the response to any new input is distributed instantly. Across every node, it is good at coordination because there is no miscommunication, no lag, no unit acting on outdated information. What a hive mind is not good at is encountering something it has no pattern for. The Shreth had been fighting organic civilizations for 60 years. Their collective intelligence contained the tactical profiles of 31 species. They knew how organic creatures responded to fear, to pain, to loss of ground, to encirclement. They had models for every major type of organic behavior under combat stress. They did not have a model for me because I was not behaving like any of those 31 species. I was behaving like a person who had spent 3 days in a supply depot building the most unreasonable thing I could think of. I waited until the Shreth outer ring reached 800 m from the outpost perimeter. Then I activated Magpie's thruster and sent it north at full speed, dropping low to the ground, skimming the basalt surface at 2 meters altitude. The Shreth targeting systems locked onto Magpie in a fraction of a second. I felt it through the neural interface as a sudden sharpening of the electromagnetic signal in my left hand, a spike that ran from my knuckles to my wrist. They had identified the drone as a threat. 14 units in the outer ring rotated to engage, their crystalline forms shifting with a precision that was almost elegant. They fired in the same moment, a coordinated volley of focused energy. Discharge. I crashed Magpie into the ground, not a landing, a controlled dive. At full thruster power, nose down, pulling up at the last half second. So the drone struck the basalt surface belly first and skidded 6 m across the rock, shedding sparks in one piece of cargo strap armor that spun away into the darkness. The volley passed overhead. Every shot missed. The Shri stopped. Not all of them, not the whole formation, but the 14 units that had fired. They stopped mid-step there, targeting data, returning results that did not match any projected outcome. The drone had been moving at a calculable speed on a calculable trajectory. It had not evaded. It had not deployed counter measures. It had simply stopped existing as a moving target by using its own chassis as a brake against the ground. No aircraft did that deliberately. No rational system did that deliberately. I had 0.4 seconds of Shreth hesitation. I used them. I activated the pulse emitter. The electromagnetic burst expanded from Magpie at ground level in a sphere approximately 40 m across. The Shreth units in that radius were all within the outer ring, not command nodes but communications relays. The nodes responsible for maintaining signal integrity between the outer formation and the core. What happened to them was not destruction, it was confusion. Silicon-based bioelectric communication is extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily precise, and it is also, like all electric systems, sensitive to interference. The pulse did not harm them, it interrupted their signal, the bioelectric resonance that connected each unit to the shared consciousness. For approximately 11 seconds, in 11 seconds, 341 units of an alien hive mind lost contact with 14 of their number. 2. A human military unit losing contact with 14 out of 341 would be an annoying interruption, a temporary gap in communication to be rooted around and restored to a hive mind that had never experienced any gap in communication at all. It was something else entirely. The reaction ran through the formation. Like a wave, not panic, the Shreth did. Not panic, but a recalculation, a massive distributed processing event, as every unit in the collective simultaneously attempted to model what had just happened and generate an appropriate response. Their geometric formations shifted fractionally, the perfectly spaced intervals fluctuating by centime, which for the Shreth was the equivalent of a stumble. It was enough. I had buried 3 mining charges in the projected advanced path of the main body, set them 2 days earlier by calculating the coalition's terrain data and the Shref's consistent preference for geometrically optimal approach vectors while the formation was Midra calculation. I triggered all 3. The basalt plane erupted at 3.200 m ahead of the Shreth main body and 40 m to either side of their center line, not to destroy them. The mining charges were standard geological equipment designed to fracture rock for survey boring. They were not powerful enough to significantly damage a concentrated mass of crystalline silicon units. What they did was throw debris, hundreds of kilograms of fractured basalt launched in expanding clouds at ground level, moving through the space. The Shreth formation was occupying the crystal surfaces of the outer units fractured on impact with the rock fragments, not destroyed but damaged. More importantly, the debris clouds passed through the hive's sensor range at the same moment their communications were restoring and the sensor data returned a picture of the engagement zone that did not match any stored tactical template. There was a drone that had deliberately destroyed its own flight profile to avoid targeting. There was an electromagnetic pulse from a ground level source with no military designation. There were explosive detonations in positions that did not correspond to any standard weapon emplacement layout. And now there was a dust and debris cloud filled with shrapnel that the Shreth were processing as either a weapon system or an environmental hazard, and they could not determine which. They stopped. The entire formation stopped, not for long, 8 seconds, maybe 9. I felt it through Magpie sensors as a sudden stillness on the electromagnetic channel, the hive signal intensity dropping as the collective shifted processing resources from advanced coordination to threat assessment. In those 8 seconds I guided Magpie out of the debris cloud, got the thruster running again, climbed to 30 m altitude and moved to a position 150 m northeast of the formation's right flank. Then the pulse emitter began its 9-minute recharge cycle, and I had no other long-range capability, and the outer ring had already recalculated new targeting solution for Magpie, and 341 crystalline units resumed their advance. I had hurt nobody. I had destroyed nothing, but the Shreth had spent 8 seconds trying to figure out what I was, and they had not found an answer. I felt the thruster heat through the interface, the vibration of the rotors, the wind against Magpie's patch chassis. I thought, good, stay confused. The outer ring sent 22 units to intercept Magpie's new position. They were fast, much faster in individual movement than I had expected, their crystal forms moving across the basalt in low, gliding strides that covered ground efficiently and quietly. Through the thermal channel I watched them come. Through the vibrational channel I felt the Shreth main body resume its advance. They were not stopping for the flanking engagement. They were multitasking, 22 units to deal. With Magpie, the rest continuing the march to the outpost, the hive did not need to pause for any one thread of action. The 22 units spread into a semicircle as they approached my position, covering 180 degrees of approach angle, no gaps in the arc, no tactical blind spots. The hive was not going to let me use the crash feint again. It had cataloged that maneuver and distributed the counter to every unit simultaneously. This was the part where most things ran out of options. I went straight toward them, full thruster, low altitude, directly at the center of the semicircle where the arc was densest. Not a feint, not a deceptive trajectory, a straight line as fast as Magpie's single thruster would push it directly into the formation. The 22 units could not process this as a rational approach. Their models did not contain a scenario where a damaged, outmatched asset charged directly into a superior containing force. They hesitated for 1.2 seconds, recalculating, rerunning the scenario through their collective analysis, because the result kept coming back as tactically nonsensical, and the hive did not act on tactically nonsensical data. I covered 40 m in those 1.2 seconds, and then I activated the chaff tubes. The emergency flares launched first, 12 of them, brilliant white-red bursts of magnesium light and thermal output that flooded the thermal sensors of every Shreth unit within a 100 m. Then the fireworks, which I had packed into the second tube in the order I found them in the recreation kit, meaning in no particular order at all, meaning what came out was a completely random sequence of colored light bursts, acoustic concussions, spinning pyrotechnic shells, and at one point something that produced a sustained green spiral pattern that honestly I had not expected and found impressive under the circumstances. The result was not a weapon. The result was a sensory disaster. The Shreth ran their sensors across 27 simultaneous light sources of varying temperature, intensity, spectral signature, and trajectory. They ran their audio processing across 11 distinct acoustic events of varying frequency and duration. They ran their electromagnetic analysis across the chaff particles embedded in the firework shells, which were standard aluminum chaff included in the recreation kit for reasons I deeply appreciated, without fully understanding every sensor system on every unit within range was processing overlapping, contradictory, non-ray repeating input data. The semicircle collapsed inward at the center as 2 units walked into each other, their coordination disrupted. 4 more stopped entirely while their individual processing buffers caught up to the hive consensus. The remaining 16 scattered to the edge of the chaff cloud, which was precisely what I needed them to do. I pulled Magpie up and over the top of the formation, cleared the chaos below, and dove for the main body. The command nodes were there, still 80 m away, moving steadily forward. The main body had watched all of this through the eyes of their flanking units, and they had recalculated accordingly. They were expecting me to try to reach the command nodes. The outer ring was already repositioning to cut off the approach vectors. I had the pulse emitter back online at 7 minutes instead of 9 because I had hit a bump on landing that apparently jarred the capacitor into a better connection. I went low again, below the line of sight of the repositioning outer ring, skimming the Basalt at 1 meter altitude, and I fired. The pulse at the maximum range I could manage, which was 38 m, aimed directly at the densest concentration of command node signal I could read on the electromagnetic channel. The burst hit, and the Shreth Collective experienced the second communications disruption in their history. The first had been 3 minutes earlier. That one had been 11 seconds of confusion. This one hit the command nodes directly, and the loss of signal propagated outward from the center like a stone dropped in water. 17 seconds. The formation fractured, not broke, not rooted, but fractured. The geometric precision of the advance losing coherence as the units at the edge continued moving on the last directive while the core was offline. The spacing shifting, the interlocking cells separating. I flew Magpie into the gap between the outer ring and the main body, corridor of open ground that appeared as the formation's geometry failed, and I deployed the last thing I had, the fragmentation ring, not at a target, at the ground, at the geometric center of the gap I was flying through. Time to detonate as I cleared the radius. Dispersal was designed for rock, for survey boring, for breaking up mineral deposits at ground level in the middle of a compromised Shreth formation. It turned the basalt beneath the advance into a field of fast-moving fragments that tore through the legs and lower surfaces of the units nearest the detonation. I felt the blast through the neural interface as a hot wave of pressure from below, and Magpie was thrown upward 30 m by the shock wave, spinning the cracked chassis, making a sound I felt as a grinding sensation in my back teeth, and I lost the stabilizers on 2 of the 4 patched rotor arms and began to spiral. I pulled the thruster hard left, then right, then cut it for a half second and let gravity help, and Magpie leveled out at 40 m, wobbling badly. One arm folded at the elbow joint where it had not been designed to fold, but flying, I was shaking in the depot. My hands were gripping my own knees hard, enough to leave marks. Through Magpie's sensors, I looked down at the Shreth formation. The command nodes were intact. The outer ring was reforming. The 17 seconds of network disruption had ended, and the hive was processing the engagement at full speed again, but the formation had stopped advancing. They were not retreating, they were assessing a full tactical reassessment, the kind the Shreth Collective issued when a battlefield variable exceeded all existing models. A Shreth tactical reassessment had never previously been triggered by anything less than a full coalition armored division. I was one person, one thruster in a coffee maker. I held Magpie at 40 m and watched them assess. The signals from the coalition vessels in high orbit were changing. I could feel the shift in the electromagnetic background because Magpie sensors were sensitive enough to pick up the communication bursts that accompany a ship bringing its full sensor array to bear on a surface event. They were watching. I held very still in the depot, my hands on my knees, and I waited to see what 341 crystalline units would decide to do about a repaired piece of disposal equipment and the single human being attached to it. Through a wire, the warmth in my left hand, the signal trace of the hive network shifted. The Shreth formation began to move backward. 1 step, 2 steps measured. Deliberate, not a route, but backward. I did not breathe for a moment. In 11 years of Shreth warfare, no organic ground force had made them withdraw from A committed advance. I let the breath out slowly. Okay, Magpie, I said to the empty depot, and the drone 40 in the air above a basalt plain on a moon that smelled like iron and cold wind. That's a start. The communications channel I had left open on a coalition frequency, more out of habit than hope, crackled for the first time since the evacuation. A voice came through, precise, clipped, slightly surprised in the specific way that someone who is never surprised sounds when something has surprised them. Anyway, Warrant Officer Vance, it was Commander Ithrex. What is that drone? I looked at the painted face on Magpie's nose cone through its own forward sensor, seeing the sharp-teethed grin from the inside. I almost laughed. I would have laughed, except the neural feedback from Magpie's damaged rotor arm was making the left side of my skull ache, and I thought laughing might turn into something less dignified. It is what the Accord could allocate. I said. There was a long silence on the channel. Then please stand by. I stood by. They came for me in a Velhari dropship 4 hours later, not a 4-minute window, not extraction point Gamma. Full military dropship, Accord markings, priority landing clearance, touching down inside the outpost perimeter with a kind of precision that said this was not an afterthought. I was in the depot when it landed. I had spent the 4 hours running a diagnostic on Magpie, which was less a diagnostic and more an exercise in cataloging how many ways a drone could be damaged and still fly. The left rotor arm was definitely done. The cargo strap armor on the forward face had taken a fragment strike and was hanging by 2 straps instead of 4. The power cell was at 11%. The sensor array was still working because the spectrometer board was apparently much harder to break than its housing had suggested. I carried Magpie onto the dropship. Under my arm, the 2 Velhari crew members watched me do this with expressions that I had learned to read in my time working with them as the look their species makes when they are experiencing something they do not have a classification for. We went up. Dropship docked with the coalition flagship, a Velhari command carrier called the Resolve. I had been on it once before, briefly for a supply coordination meeting that Commander Ithrex had spent 37 minutes of the allotted 40 discussing the inefficiency of human supply chain management. It was a beautiful ship built in the way that Velhari engineering always was, with the kind of perfect symmetry that felt less like aesthetics and more like a principle. I was taken to a conference room and given water, which I drank in. Then I was left alone for 20 minutes, which I spent sitting with Magpie on the table in front of me and working on the left rotor arm with a multi-tool I had in my vest pocket. Ithrex came in with 4 other officers, 2 Velhari, 1 Kaysari, and 1 I did not recognize, a species I had not encountered before, tall and thin with jointless arms and a face that was mostly forehead. Ithrex looked at me. He looked at Magpie. He looked at the multi-tool. My hand. He pulled out a chair and sat down. The Shreth Collective's vanguard has retreated 12 km and stopped, he said. They have not resumed the advance. Yes, I said, in 11 years of Shreth contact they have never retreated from a committed advance. Yes, I said again, you did this with a decommissioned reconnaissance drone. I set the multi-tool down. I did this with a decommissioned reconnaissance drone, a geology spectrometer, a coffee maker, communications hardware, mining Charges, emergency flares, and founding. Day fireworks. Silence. There were fireworks at outpost. KL7, Ither said morale kit standard. Human issue for extended deployments. He looked at the case's officer who was taking notes on a tablet, the Kasari's notation system looked like music. Notation, rows of dots and lines, and they were writing very fast. Tell us. Everything, said. I told them. Everything, all of it, every decision. Every component, every calculation. I explained the spectrometer sensor array. And why the 3 channels I kept drew less power than the military raid array had. I explained the EMF emitter and the capacitor bank from the communications booster. I explained the fragmentation ring and why I had aimed it at the ground instead of the units. I explained the chaff in the fireworks and why the combination of thermal, visual, acoustic, and electromagnetic noise at close range had compromised the Shreth's distributed sensor processing. I explained the neural interface and the crash feint and why I had decided that a deliberately non-rational approach vector would take longer for hive mind predictive system to model than a rational one. The Kasari officer stopped writing once, looked up at me, and then resumed writing twice as fast. The officer, whose species I did not recognize, had been completely still for the first 20 minutes. When I got to the part about the crash feint, it made a sound that I later learned was its species equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The feint, Ithrach said. Carefully, you intentionally damaged your primary asset to avoid a targeting solution. Yes, you accepted guaranteed damage to your own equipment as a tactic. I accepted calculable damage, I said. Chassis could take a belly landing on basalt. I ran the numbers. You ran the numbers, Ithrex repeated in the tone of someone learning what a phrase means for the first time. The landing was controlled. The cargo strap armor absorbed most of the contact. I estimated about 40% chance of losing a rotor arm, which I was prepared to accept, the Kasari officer said. Something in their own language, Ithrex answered. The exchange was brief. My colleague asks, Ither said, what calculation you used to determine that 40% chance of mission critical asset damage was acceptable? I thought about this. None, I said. It felt right. More silence, a longer one. It felt right, Ithrex said. Yes, I had enough information to know the feint was the best available option. I did not have enough information to calculate the exact risk, so I made a judgment based on a feeling, based on experience, intuition, and available data, which the moment is what a feeling is. The unknown species made another sound. Longer this time. Ithrex looked at me for a long moment with his polished obsidian eyes. Warrant Officer Vance, he said, I owe you an apology. I waited. When you volunteered to remain at Outpost KL7, I considered your decision tactically unsound. When the Accord provided you with the MQ-99 unit, I considered the allocation appropriate to the tactical value of the position. He paused. I was incorrect on both counts. You could not have known, I said. Because I meant it. He could not have known. I could not have known. He agreed. That is precisely the problem. Warrant Officer, the Accord does not know how to evaluate human judgment. We observe the inputs and the outputs, and the relationship between them does not conform to our models. He leaned forward slightly. The Shreth Collective has issued a reclassification of human Species threat assessment we received. The signal intercept 40 minutes ago. They have elevated humanity from Category 2 to a new designation they have created for this event. He paused. The designation translates approximately as unmodelable. I sat with that word for a moment. Unmodelable. 341 units of the most analytically advanced military intelligence the galaxy had produced, and after 72 hours of one person with a broken drone and a coffee maker, the best they could do was say, "We do not know what this is." I looked at Magpie on the table, the cracked chassis, the folded rotor arm, the cargo straps, the painted face sharp, toothed and slightly alarmed, looking up at the ceiling of a Velhari command carrier conference room. What happens now? I asked. Ithrex looked at the other officers. Something passed between them, not words, just a shared look of the kind that exists in any species that has been working together long enough. The Accord has requested an emergency session. He said there is a proposal on the table to formally restructure human integration into coalition military operations, not as infantry support, not as supply chain management. He hesitated, as if the next words were ones he was trying on for the first time as asymmetric warfare specialist, chaos consultants, the term your own military theorists use as field improvisers. I blinked. The Accord wants to hire humanity for our willingness to crash drones on purpose. I said. The Accord, Ithrex said carefully, wants access to the cognitive framework that looks at a decommissioned reconnaissance unit and a geology spectrometer and generates a battlefield solution that a Shreth vanguard cannot counter. I thought about my mother calling me stubborn, my engineering instructors calling it aptitude, my exartner calling it exhausting. That cognitive framework, I said, is what we call being bad at giving up. Kasari officer looked up from there. Notes, the unknown species made a sound I later learned was laughter. Ithrex did not laugh, but something in the arrangement of his face shifted slightly. The session is in 6 hours, he said. The Accord would like you to attend, to speak, to explain, if you are willing, how a human approaches a problem with no adequate resources and no certain outcome. I can do that, I said. There is also the matter of the MQ-99 unit. He glanced at Magpie. The Accord's engineering division has requested permission to analyze it, to understand the modifications. I looked at Magpie, at the cargo straps, at the spectrometer board visible through the cracked chassis panel. I had not had time to close properly, at the face I had painted on the nose cone, the ridiculous toothy grin, the wide, startled eyes. They can analyze it, I said, but I want it back when they're done, and I don't want them to repaint the face. Ierx looked at the nose cone for a long moment. I will note that in the transfer agreement, he said. I picked up my multi-tool and went back to work on the rotor arm. 6 hours later, I stood in front of the Galactic Accord's emergency session, which was held in a chamber that could seat 400 representatives and was filled that evening to every seat. 41 species present in person or by transmission, filling the tiered rows of the chamber with more biological diversity than I had ever seen in one place. Tall, short, crystalline, fluid, bilaterally symmetrical, radially symmetrical, things that breath and things that did not, things that saw in frequencies I could not imagine and heard in ranges I could not access. all of them looking at me. I was wearing my work uniform because no one had offered me anything else, and I had not asked. There was a streak of thermal tape on my left sleeve and a smudge of something that might have been motor or oil on my right boot. I stood at the speaker's position in the center of the chamber, and I thought about what to say. I thought about the outpost, the empty depot, the sound of the last shuttle leaving, the silence after. I thought about Magpie on the floor of that depot, fallen out of its crate, cracked in, dead, censored, and labeled with a word that meant it was over. I thought about what I had felt when I picked it up. Not hope exactly, not courage, something more specific than either of those. Specific feeling of looking at a broken thing and already starting to see what it could be. I cleared my throat. My name is Sierra Vance. I said, I am a field engineer. My job is to fix things that other people have given up on. The chamber was completely quiet. You want to know how I did what I did on Dreskin Roman 4. You want to understand the cognitive framework. You want to know why a human looks at disposal equipment and sees a battlefield asset. I paused. I will tell you, but I want you to understand something first. I looked around the chamber. 400 representatives, 41 species, all watching. None of what I did was special, not by human standards. Every human engineer I have ever worked with would have done something similar, not the same thing. We would not all make the same choices. But every one of us, given 72 hours, a broken drone, and a room full of salvage, would have built something, not because we are trained to, not because our doctrine requires it, because we cannot help it. I paused. We were a species that nearly destroyed itself. Several times over, we ran out of resources and we found different resources. We ran out of space and we found different spaces. We built things that failed and we built them again differently, and they failed again, and we built them a third time. We have been breaking things and fixing them and breaking them differently for as long as we have existed, and somewhere in that process we became something that your models cannot capture. The chamber was still the kind of still that happens when 400 very different kinds of minds are all thinking about the same thing. The Shreth called us unmodelable. I said, I think that is the most accurate thing anyone has said about us. You cannot model a species that rewrites its own behavior every time the model fails. You cannot predict an organism that treats every failure as information. You cannot build a tactical forecast for a people who look at the word no and hear the word yet. I took a breath. Give us the broken things, give us the problems you have decided cannot be solved. Give us the disposal units and the salvage depot and the 72 hours. I looked at the assembled chamber one more time. All of those different eyes and sensor arrays and perception organs all pointed at one human woman in an oil-stained uniform. We will build you something you have never seen before. We cannot promise it will be elegant. We cannot promise it will be pretty. I paused. We can promise it will work. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the case's representative began the notation equivalent of applause. Then another section joined. Then another. The sound it made was not like human applause. It was its own thing entirely, a layered percussion of different surfaces and different rhythm, 41 species expressing the same recognition in 41 different ways. I stood in the middle of it and thought about Magpie sitting in the engineering Base 6 decks below, still wearing its painted face, the vote to formally restructure human integration into Accord military operations past 3 days. Later, not unanimously, 31 in favor. 8 abstentions, 2 against. The 2 against were both Velhari factions who believed the restructuring moved too fast. Ithrex voted in favor. I was in the observation deck when the result was announced, watching the planet Dreskin. Roman 4 below, the northern continent, still in gray and quiet. The Shreth had not resumed their advance. Intelligence suggested they were still in the process of revising their threat models for the engagement, which the Accord's analysts found remarkable. The Shreth had never spent more than 4 hours on a post-engagement recalculation. Before, they had been revising for 63 hours. Ithrex came and stood beside me. The observation deck window, we watched the planet for a while without speaking. The engineering division finished their analysis of the MQ-99. He said they produced a 1,700-page report. What did it conclude? That the modifications were improvised from available salvage with no consistent engineering methodology, that several of the component integrations should not function by any standard electrical principle, that the fragmentation system was specifically not designed for aerial deployment and should not have been deployable from the chassis configuration you built. He paused, and that nevertheless all of it worked. Yes, I said, their recommendation is that the MQ-99 be preserved in its current state and placed in the Accord's military history collection. They believe it represents a significant historical artifact. I looked at the planet. They want to put it in a museum, I said. Yes, I thought about Magpie, the cracked chassis, the toothy grin, the rotor arm I had almost finished repairing before the dropship came. Tell them they can have it, I said, on 2 conditions. Yes, they leave it exactly as it is. Every cargo strap, every piece of thermal tape, every crack, and they keep the face. Ayerx was quiet for a moment. The face, he said, the painted face on the nose cone. Another pause. The engineering division will find this aesthetically unusual. Yes, I said, that is the point. He was quiet. The planet turned slowly below us, the gray basalt plain of the northern continent moving into shadow. There is something I have wanted to ask you, said in a tone that was different from his command voice, quieter, less certain. When you painted the face on the drone, what was the purpose of that? I had thought about this, actually. I had thought about it several times in the past week, trying to give it a rational explanation. I did not have one. It made me feel better. I said, functionally it provided no advantage. No, it added weight to the chassis. About 12 G of marker ink, yes. And yet, you did it, yes. Ithrex was silent. Outside, the stars were doing what stars always do, burning slowly in the dark, with a patience that made human problems seem brief and specific and almost sweet. I think said finally that this is what my analysts cannot capture in their models, not the technical improvisation. The technical improvisation we can document and study and attempt to replicate, but the 12 G of marker ink, the face painted on a disposal unit to make a single person feel better before a battle no one expected them to survive. He turned to look at me. That is not a rational input, but it was part of the system. It was part of what made the system work. I thought about this. The face is why I named it Magpie. I said, and naming it made me more careful with it. And being more careful with it meant I made better decisions about how to use it because it felt like something I was responsible for, not just something I was operating. A relationship with a machine. IRCH said humans do that. I said we name our tools, we name our ships, we name the drones we build out of coffee makers and cargo straps because the names make us take better care of them, and taking better care of them makes them work better. It is not rational, but it is true. IRCH turned back to the window. Unmodelable, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. That is what they said. I agreed. We stood in the observation deck and watched the stars. Somewhere below us, in the engineering bay of the Resolve, Magpie was sitting on an analysis table with cables plugged into its diagnostic port, and Velhari engineers documenting every component of its construction. The toothy grin on its nose cone was pointing at the ceiling. In a meeting room somewhere else on the ship, the first draft of the Accords human integration proposal was being reviewed by representatives who were trying to write policy language for a concept their legal frameworks had not previously required. The formal recognition that unpredictability could be a strategic resource, that a species' inability to be modeled was not a weakness in their intelligence, but a feature of it, that the gap between what could be predicted and what a human actually did in a given situation was not a bug in human cognition. It was the whole point of us. The Shreth called it unmodelable. We call it Tuesday, we call it stubbornness, we call it aptitude, we call it exhausting, we call it painting a face on a broken drone at midnight on a moon we were not supposed to survive, because it made us feel better, and feeling better made us more careful, and being more careful meant we did not give up. The Shreth revised their threat assessment models for 63 hours and did not resume their advance. They put Magpie in a museum exactly as it was. Cargo straps and cracks, and 12G of red marker ink grinning at the ceiling. The plaque beside it took 3 months to write, because the Accords historians kept arguing about how to describe what it was. Eventually they settled on something honest. It reads, built from what was available, flown by someone who did not stop. That is, I think, the most accurate description of humanity that anyone has ever written. We are not the strongest species in this galaxy. We are not the most technologically advanced. We do not have the longest memory or the sharpest senses or the most efficient biology. We are soft and brief and complicated in ways that confuse everyone who tries to model us, including ourselves. But give us a broken thing and a deadline. Give us a disposal unit and a supply depot, and 72 hours. We will build you something. We will paint a face on it. We will name it something ridiculous. And then we will fly it straight at the most powerful military force in the known galaxy and make it blink, not because the doctrine requires it, not because the math says it will work, but because we looked at the word impossible and heard the word yet. We always hear yet. That is the one thing about us that nothing in this universe will ever successfully model.